So the web is increasingly consumed on mobile devices, and in many cases websites were not designed to be used on mobile devices, and certainly the marketing and advertising that happens on those sites was not designed to be consumed in that way, and so it needs to be rethought with that context in mind. The fourth item on my list of bullet points is that the web will be more automated, and I talked about a couple of things early on in relation to Web 3.0, so let's return to those and talk about them a bit. The semantic web was one of those, and the other one was the Internet of Things. So the semantic web is about machines understanding natural language. Internet of Things is about more and more devices being attached to the network. Digging into the semantic web more deeply, it's another facet of personalization. This is basically about I no longer have to explicitly state my preferences, but in fact you can infer from the things that I say online some things about who I am and what my preferences are, and therefore tailor things to me. If the web understands my natural language, I don't have to work as hard to proactively tell the various sites that I visit and services that I use what I want and what I'm trying to achieve. It automates my interaction with the web, which could save me time, using cues that I may give off unconsciously or without deliberately trying to do that. And it may also allow me to spend less time on websites and on the web itself because of all the information I'm providing indirectly. And that frees up my time for other activities. So from a user point of view, you can see how this increases in efficiency and so on. To be honest, we're some way from this reality still. Tim Berners-Lee proposed this idea some time ago, and the technology just isn't there yet. It hasn't caught up with his vision yet. So it's something that will happen over time, but we're certainly not in the middle of that yet. We're still very early on in this thread, but it is an emerging theme. The problem is when technology gets too clever, people start to freak out. People start to get worried about it. And one recent example is that Facebook recently turned on this facial recognition feature where it can tell that the face in this picture is the same person as the face in that picture, and say, you know, if you tell me who this is, I can tag all the pictures with this person in them with that person's name, so you don't have to go through one by one. So I'll gather the 57 pictures that you have in your photo albums, and I will tag them all the same if you just tell me who this person is. Now, people didn't really understand what Facebook was trying to do there. They were worried that it would automatically detect who you were and then tell everybody else who you were and so on. And this is still something where they just say, these 57, we're pretty sure they're the same person. Can you tell us who it is so that you can tag them in your photo albums? But the backlash was obvious, and I don't know if you can read this at the back, but you know, this was just the first 6 results on Facebook when I searched Facebook facial recognition, and they're all people being worried about it, basically. So the first one is the Federal Trade Commission here in the US, the FTC, having a complaint about the new software, an editorial about it here, another editorial about it there. The Connecticut Attorney General expressed concern about it. This is you know, another blog and how, you know, what you can do about it, essentially, in an editorial from the Washington Post. So all these people worrying about this new feature. Partly it was that Facebook didn't explain it very clearly, partly it's that people always get in a bit of a froth when Facebook does anything regarding privacy. But the problem is this is about computers getting potentially too clever. And there was another similar brouhaha when Google talked a while ago about facial recognition software it was working on. People were concerned that somebody could create an app that would let you go out, snap a picture of some random stranger, and it would go back into their database and find out who they were based on Google Images and tell you who they were, and then provide all kinds of profile information based on blogs and Twitter and Facebook and so on. And that really freaks people out. And so, you know, these companies have been very careful to say we're not going to do that. But you know, Google and Facebook are big companies that want to keep their users happy. There are lots of smaller companies around that might want to do things to make money for good reasons or bad reasons using similar technologies. So people do worry about this kind of thing. So there's a backlash against this whole concept of computers getting a bit too clever for their own good. Let's talk about the Internet of Things, this explosion of connected devices. I talked about several of them already. TVs, digital video recorders, gaming consoles and so on are all increasingly network connected. They have Ethernet jacks or wireless connectivity. But you know, people have been talking forever about refrigerators. Certainly cars increasingly have some kind of mobile connectivity built in, and certainly can sync with the devices that you bring into the car. So even if the car doesn't have connectivity, your phone over Bluetooth can then share its connectivity with the car. Houses, smart homes, where you can turn your electricity on and off or monitor it remotely. And people have been talking forever about refrigerators that can tell when they're getting empty or when you've run out of something and tell you what to buy next time you're at the supermarket. Some of that's more Jetsons than other parts of it, but it's all there as a possibility, and certainly we're seeing some of those products today. Lastly, the web will become more fragmented, more balkanized, and I've talked about some of that already, but really it's happening by platforms. And what I mean by platforms is companies that are building, if you like, their own part of the web that is run by them and that acts like a little microcosm of the web that allows people to develop things on top of it, where they can serve things up to users within a sort of a walled garden environment. And that means that people don't go onto the full web, they stay in that little walled garden and they're somewhat shut off from the real world around them. And there are multiple examples of those platforms, and three obvious ones I've mentioned already: Google, Apple, Facebook. You could put Microsoft in here, you could put others in here as well. But these are three of the biggest ones, and they're all building their own platforms. And Facebook is itself a platform as a website, and people have applications, companies like Zynga, which has Farmville and various other games that run pretty much exclusively on Facebook. They've created a whole slew of applications there which clog up my Facebook feed very regularly, but which are creating value on top of what's essentially a platform that Facebook has created. And more, as I say, people consume the web from within Facebook. Apple, through the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple TV, and various other devices, running iOS, which is their operating system for all of these devices. I've created a platform as well where people can stay within a safe environment, they can consume apps that they know have been pre-vetted and so on, but they are then shut off still from the web as a whole. Google's doing similar things with both Android as a mobile operating system, but also through Google Apps and the various Google services and Google Search, as we already talked about. And so there are these various sort of platforms or islands, if you like, where people can kind of get stuck in a corner of the web and never really leave it, and where that experience is not open and democratic as it might be on the web itself, but rather is more and more controlled by a single company that's making decisions for users about what they can and can't see and access and do. But in fact, those are to some extent integrated platforms as well. There is some overlap between them. Obviously Facebook has applications for the Android platform and for iOS, and so Facebook and these other platforms are integrating in some ways. Apple has just announced that the next version of its iPhone operating system will have deep Twitter integration. It wouldn't be a big surprise to see something similar with Facebook over time as well. And Google and Apple, although they're competitors in many ways, obviously you get Google Search and various Google apps like email and calendar and so on work very well on Apple devices. And obviously people access a lot of Google services from Apple laptops and phones and so on. So there is integration between these platforms, but they are increasingly self-contained corners of the web, if you like, that aren't necessarily open as the web itself is. And that's an extension of both personalization, where these companies are telling me, based on my preferences, what I've bought before, what I've searched for before, they're going to serve me up relevant answers and things that they think I'll like. But it's also an extension of mobilization, where people are retreating from a full web experience back into mobile applications and then getting just a very filtered view of the web. But in both cases, users aren't on the open web anymore, they are in some corner of the web. There are a number of tensions, I've mentioned some of them already, in the future of the internet. Things that are moving in one direction and where users are kind of, at least in some cases, trying to pull it back in the other direction again. Or cases where there are legitimately separate groups of users that want the web to move in different directions. This isn't a comprehensive list, but this is a partial list of some of those tensions that are going on. And I mentioned personalization. We had this book called The Filter Bubble. His argument is essentially that this personalization is a bad thing because it just retrenches us and reinforces our existing prejudices and biases, rather than giving us real information on all the information that's out there in the world. And he's arguing that we should be able to remove those filters at will so that we get unfiltered information. But there's a tension there. People like personalization. They like the fact that these services learn what they like and will serve up things that are relevant to them. Sharing versus privacy, and Facebook's always in hot water because it's always seemingly in the wrong place on this particular spectrum. But privacy is something that's extremely important to many people, but it's also a generational issue where the younger you are, the more likely you are to be willing to share all kinds of things online, or at least not to be very careful about what you share online, whether that's a deliberate or passive behavior. But there's a real tension there, and you just have to look at parents and their kids, for example, around their Facebook usage to see that tension. But Facebook and Google and others are always getting into hot water because of perceived privacy breaches, and there's a real tension there. Safety and openness, the classic example of that I think would be the Apple approach to applications and the Google approach to applications. Apple has this curated application store. They have very strict rules about what can and can't be allowed in. Google doesn't. Google has a very much more open approach where you can publish it to the store and it pretty much appears right away. They do occasionally take things down when they're proven to have malware or other problems, but it's very much more open. But for some people, that's a scary experience. It feels chaotic, it feels dangerous. They worry they're going to get into hot water in some way. For other people, that's just what they want. They don't want Steve Jobs making the decision for them, essentially, and so they want a more open experience. And then lastly, and this is the one that I referred to with that Andrew King quote earlier on, that there's a sense that all this democracy on the internet just creates a load of rubbish, and in fact what we want is a more creative, professional, high quality experience. And there are certainly some people that would cry and scream if you tried to take that aspect away, but there are other people that would very much like a more managed and curated experience. AOL is still around here in the US, and that's very much what they offer for their users. But those tensions are there on the web. And
can you explain a little bit more this tension between expertise and democracy?
Yeah, so I mean, really, if you look at what people like to consume online, but even beyond online in their world as a whole, there are people that love reading blogs, things that are created by ordinary individuals that don't have a big company behind them that want to just consume that, or that who, when they want to consume videos, will go straight to YouTube and their favorite channel that may be some quirky person somewhere that creates just the kind of videos that they like in their bedroom. But there are other people that want to watch the big blockbuster movies or the television shows from the major television networks, who only want to read newspapers with mastheads that have been around for 150 years and so on and so forth. And so there are people that want a managed experience, and there are people that want that very open kind of Wild West experience. And nobody's suggesting that you shut this off. That's kind of censorship. People, almost nobody wants that except in repressive regimes. But there are people that would drift naturally towards that more managed and curated and high quality experience, and people that prefer this experience. And what Google and Facebook are doing with some of their personalization is, in some ways, trying to match users' preferences with what they feed them. And the worry for some people is that actually, by doing that, you don't get the openness, you don't get the full experience of life, and you just end up retreating back into your corner where you have these crazy thoughts that never get challenged because you're just being fed what you said you want.
And the red points means?
Oh, this was just kind of saying they're kind of sliders that different people, you can imagine if me personally, I might move this one over to the left and this one over to the right. They kind of, that's the intention. It doesn't mean where we are now or anything like that. This is just to sort of suggest, these are sort of, you imagine like a graphical, like an equalizer on your stereo that you kind of move them up and down or side to side. Yes?
Are you suggesting with that you're going to have to get kind of a ranking of expertise when you run a search, or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that may well be something that, Google does it, I think, behind the scenes and implicitly, but not explicitly today. If you're always clicking on the New York Times result when you look for a certain piece of news, and they're going to promote the New York Times to the top of your search results. Whereas if you're always clicking on the Huffington Post or some obscure blog somewhere, then they're going to promote those results. So there may not be an explicit expertise ranking in there, but they are certainly feeding back to you what you've said you prefer through what you click on and what you search for. Advertising versus free. This is another thing about the internet that many people have commented on. Chris Anderson wrote a great book called Free about how things are more and more free, at least incrementally on the web, and what that means. The challenge is that things that are free online are free for one of only a couple of reasons. They're free because the company's just trying to grow really big before they figure out how to monetize that. Twitter would be an obvious example of that. It's still free to the user, but they still haven't quite figured out how they're going to make money because it is free. The other one is that it's free because it's explicitly ad funded, and that's the business model. The problem is that when something is free based on advertising, if you're not paying, then you're not the consumer, you're the product, because you're being sold to advertisers. And so essentially, this is not my thought, this was a comment that somebody left on a blog that went kind of viral after they said it, because it seemed to sum up so perfectly what so many people feel about online advertising. And this is one of the fundamental problems with many of the websites that we use. Facebook, I keep talking about Facebook, but it's a good example again of this, where Facebook's objectives and incentives are very much not aligned with its users' objectives and incentives. Users want to keep as much information private as they can within the circles that they would like it to be kept within. Facebook wants it to be as open as possible, because then they can serve up advertising against it, they can expose that information to advertisers and so on. And so it brings users and advertisers and site owners into conflict. And so this is a fundamental tension as well on the internet. People don't talk about enough, but there is this conflict between users and site owners when advertising is a major source of revenue. And so as you go to serve up advertising to people, you have to always be thinking of, am I serving their interests? Is this going to improve their experience on this site, or degrade it in some way? So we talked about how we see the internet going over the next few years. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about some of the implications for the work that you might be doing. On the one hand, you can see this as a golden age for marketers. There's so many of the things that I've talked about are huge helps for people that are trying to target specific customers with specific offerings. There's that well-known phrase from John Wanamaker, I know half the money I spend on advertising is wasted, I just don't know which half. And the personalization, the customization, the semantic web, all of these things hold out the promise that you could eventually serve up to specific users exactly what they're interested in, based on either explicitly expressed preferences or implicit preferences based on their behavior, based on what they say on blogs, on Twitter, on Facebook, who they interact with, which sites they consume, and so on. So there is this promise that this could be a golden age for marketers, because they can reach exactly the consumers they want with exactly the offer that's right for them, be very customized and targeted, and suddenly your return on every advertising dollar is much better. And that breaks out in multiple ways. So the more social aspects of the web, you use people's friends to sell them the goods and services. We've seen this on Facebook, where you see the little links on the top right sometimes saying, your friend liked this, don't you want to check it out too, essentially. But you can use the fact that your friends have liked something, whether it's Google's +1 button on its searches, or whether it's on Facebook, or whether it's on Twitter, somebody who's one of your followers or somebody that you follow has recommended a product, that could be used to serve up advertising. Personalization, as I said just now, more and more what people like, and therefore you can make sure you don't serve up the bad stuff and do serve up the stuff they do like. Hulu, which is a big online video site here in the US that does content from multiple television networks, they serve up advertising during the videos, and frequently they will have a little button at the top that says, is this relevant to you, yes or no? And frequently they'll actually replace one of the ads with a little poll that says, do you make decisions about buying washing powder in your house, or do you buy the groceries, do you influence which groceries are bought, or do you make no decisions at all about groceries? And they're really trying to target the advertising much more than regular television advertising could do, which is broadcast to all users just the same. Mobile, I haven't really talked about this aspect of it, but with location-based services on mobile devices, you can now know where people are and therefore send them advertising and other marketing that's appropriate to their specific location. I signed up for a service with AT&T here in the US recently, which sends me text messages whenever I'm close to a store that participates in their program, and says, if you take this code that we've just texted you into the store, you'll get 15% off. That's the beginning of that kind of location-based targeted advertising. So not just user behavior-based, but location-based as well. And lastly, automation. So you know more about me because of what I say online, even though I haven't explicitly told you. So these are all the sort of good aspects. But there are also new barriers to connecting with users, and that's the sort of worrying downside of all of this. That increasing fragmentation I talked about means you can't just push something through the web and expect it to get to users, because they're going to be filtering it through Facebook, they'll be filtering it through mobile applications on Android or Apple devices. And so trying to reach your audience is harder, because you have to figure out which of those platforms or communities you have to go through to reach them. Personalization may make it completely impossible to know whether you even can reach the users you're trying to reach. I had that BP search example earlier. You know, if you are BP and you're trying to reach people with a particular message and you're trying to do search engine optimization, for example, that's all very well. You may be able to increase BP's search ranking on your PC, but unfortunately you can't possibly know what I'm getting in my search rankings, because you don't see the way that Google filters my search results based on my own preferences. And so that personalization can actually be a real barrier to reaching the users that you want to reach, because you can't possibly know what Google is serving up to them. You can't know what Facebook is filtering for them. Automation may remove some decision making from users. I mean, that refrigerator example I use is a bit hypothetical still, but how do you serve up advertising to a refrigerator? You know, if the refrigerator is making decisions about what you need to buy next time at the store based on what you've run out of and based on what you've bought before, how do you insert yourself into that process and make sure the users are actively making decisions still? As I said, that's an extreme example, but you can see how automation of all kinds of things online suddenly means users are spending less time actually online making decisions, doing research. They're just having ideal results served up to them where there's no room for interference. And then lastly, social recommendations are very hard to fake and to force. People don't like being pushed things on the basis that a certain friend liked it. They don't like feeling manipulated or feeling that their friends are being manipulated by being used as a tool for advertising. And so that can backfire as well. That has to be very carefully managed. So all of these things are potential downsides of the trends I talked about.
Excuse me, talking about automation,
yeah.
Is only Google filtering, or also Bing and Yahoo filtering all the results for you?
Well, you know, Bing does this sort of Facebook-related filtering, and they all do it to some extent. There are some search engines out there now. I think there's one called DuckDuckGo, which explicitly doesn't filter results, and so they're actually using that as a selling point. But with automation here, I mean, that Google stuff is more under the sort of personalization heading. Automation is more the sort of semantic web and Internet of Things type stuff, where, you know, if more of the devices in your life have their own internet connection and are constantly reporting their state and other information about themselves without you, the user, having to do anything, and if websites are increasingly able to pick up on unconscious cues that I'm sending out through my interactions on social networks or through my web searches, then suddenly some decision making may be taken out of my hand, and I may be no longer actively making some of the decisions I did before, because I trust my devices, my services to make those decisions for me. I mean, an active example is in Gmail. They now have this priority inbox where you can say, you know, this is important to me, but they're guessing first of all, and then you just tweak the algorithm. So, but you're explicitly saying this is important to me and this isn't, and that's another form of automation where certain things get filtered out and I may never see them. Maybe because I said so, but maybe because Google thought based on my past behavior that I didn't want to see them. And ultimately, the challenge with things like the semantic web, with all the information that people are putting out there about themselves now through Twitter, which is very public, through Facebook, which is semi-private, it's easy for your competitors to know as much about your users as you do, and perhaps even more if they're better at this kind of stuff. So, you know, it used to be that customers could either complain to their friends, in which case it didn't go anywhere, or they would complain back to the company that was providing a product or service, and then they would be the only ones who knew about it. But today people increasingly complain about things on social networking sites and so on, and so that information can be aggregated and gathered by third parties who may be competitors, who may then use that as an opportunity to serve something back. You know, somebody said on Twitter this week, you know, people who think that Twitter is about saying what you had for breakfast are all wrong. Twitter is for complaining about airlines. But because, you know, that is increasingly what people do. They have a bad customer service experience and they whine about it on Twitter. They kind of blow off steam. And if they have 15 followers who are all their friends anyway, it doesn't really matter. But if you have 500, 1,000, 50,000 followers, all of a sudden that's quite significant. And if it gets picked up by some other people and retweeted, then suddenly, you know, it grows exponentially and you have a real network effect. So, but the point is that, you know, you no longer have this binary relationship with your customer where you have information flows only between the two of you. That information flow is now open to everybody, and whoever knows how to take advantage of that can really use it against you if you have a poor experience, and use that to jump in and become a new supplier. To remind you of what I've talked about, the web will be more social because it will be more integrated into the fabric of the web and not just in discrete corners. More personalized for good or bad. Things will be filtered and customized for you. More mobile, meaning it'll be consumed more on mobile devices, but also through mobile applications rather than in a web browser. More automated in a variety of different ways that we've talked about, and more fragmented as well through those various platforms. And each of those things has benefits for users and potential drawbacks for users. They have benefits for people in marketing and drawbacks for people in marketing. So there's no simple answer about what the future of the internet is. There is no single definition of what Web 3.0 is, but it's really a combination of all of these things. Okay, well, if you do have any more, my contact details are on the final slide. Hopefully you'll all get access to the slides, but if you don't, you can always send me an email or contact me on Twitter or whatever makes the most sense for you. My email address is very straightforward. It's my first name and then my last name at ovum.com, and my Twitter handle is even more straightforward. So you can see it right here, Jan Ovum. So feel free to contact me either of those ways or give me a call. And I'll be happy to kind of keep the dialogue going. So thanks very much for having me.